Okay, now we're going to talk about large animal nutrition. This is chapter 10. It's very similar to small animal nutrition, but there are some slight differences in what is important for larger animals in the way that we look at the foods. So optimal nutrition is based on productivity and profitability. We raise livestock based on how profitable they are for the farmer, and so it has a lot to do with nutrition. You need to be knowledgeable as a technician. You want to be able to identify potential problems. You are in charge of increasing clients' understanding, especially with smaller farms, especially with 4-H and FFA, if you are doing some education with those groups as well. Nutrition research is a huge part of the livestock industry. We want to use our potential. Nutrition is important for successful breeding and also generation of high quality meat. Nutrients are ingested to support life. They are retained by the animal. They help with homeostasis or balance within the body, for tissue replenishment and development of specifically muscles, for reproduction, and for production of milk, wool, and meat. Nutrients are excreted in the urine or feces, and so that's of nutrients to provide for the patient, for the pet or livestock. Maintenance nutrient requirements, or MNRs, are what are needed just to sustain body weight, no gain or loss. We have certain standards on these, and these are published by the National Research Council, which is the nutritional board that looks at nutrition for all animals. Elements that influence nutrient requirements in large animals: their body size, their health status, stress, environment, exercise, behavior, genetics, reproductive status, gender, and breed. So digestion. Digestion is the process of breakdown of carbohydrate, protein, and fat into absorbable nutrients. We talked about this with small animal nutrition. Proteins break down to amino acids, carbohydrates break down to sugars, and fats break down into fatty acids. Proteins and amino acids, these are the principal constituents of organs and soft tissue. There are 10 essential amino acids that must be supplied in the diet, and there are 12 non-essential amino acids. These are made in the body. Proteins are measured by protein biological value, protein efficiency ratio, so how well do we use these proteins, how well do we digest them, absorb them, and use them, and then protein quality. Carbohydrates are actually the primary energy source for livestock. So when we talk about dogs and cats, if you remember, proteins are the primary energy source for livestock. Protein building blocks. Fats and carbohydrates both are used for energy source for livestock, but with companion animals. But for livestock specifically, it's carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are less expensive than any fats or proteins. They're more readily available than fats or proteins, and they must be broken down to simple sugars by absorption or for absorption by the livestock digestive system. So that rumen in the four stomachs of the cow or the ruminant is important to help breaking down those. It ferments those carbohydrates into something that the animal can digest. Fats are broken down to fatty acids. Dietary energy is 2.5 times more than carbs and proteins. It helps with the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, which we know are important for reproductive, skin health, eye health, etc. So protein quality has a lot to do with what's present in the environment, what they're foraging out on pasture. And if you look at this chart, you can see percent of protein as is, which is as fed. And you can see in March to April, we start to see an increase in the amount of protein that's available in forage. And in August, we see that decline. Young growing cattle, we see that in the pasture, we want young growing cattle in the pasture from April through the end of July. Lactation, again, It's at 9%. We have plenty of that available in the forage. At 6%, it's adequate for pregnant cows. And so this is what we're looking for. And if it's not this time of year, we need to provide it for the animal because it's below the level the rest of the year. So how do we provide this type of protein quality that's present in the pasture in the summer months for the rest of the months of the year? Carbohydrates is the primary source of energy. It breaks down to simple sugars. We have storage molecules, starch and fructans, and then structural polysaccharides. Animal feed carbohydrates, we can get them from concentrates such as grains, high starch compounds or forage, for instance, grass, hays, or legumes. And the intake need is related to activity levels and energy needs. So just like I showed with that chart, whether they're young and growing, whether they're lactating, or whether they're gestating. Total digestible nutrients, TDNs, is also considered digestible energy. So it's the same thing as a bowl of food for a dog, and minus the feces, it's the same thing. Here we have a bowl of grain minus the feces equals total digestible nutrients. It's a measure of nutritive value of the food. It's expressed as a percentage of the ration or in units of weight, but not as a caloric number. We often see that in horse feeds, but in cow feeds, it's rations or units of weight. It does not take into account losses in urine, combustible gases, or heat. Those are as other measurements. Like we talked about with companion animals, metabolizable energy is our TDN, or digestible energy, minus the loss in urine and gas. And when we look at swine and poultry feeds, a lot of times those will be measured in MEs. Net energy is when we take the metabolizable energy and dial it down into body heat loss during metabolism of nutrients. And we're dialing this down for beef, dairy, and sheep because that's where a lot of production is lost. And so we want to know what that net energy is for those animals for that food so that we can give them just the precise amount of food. Gross energy is just that total energy that's potentially available in a food. So again, variables affecting energy requirements are activity, environment, body stage, body size, life stage, and reproductive status. We need to remember our minerals, our macrominerals: salt, sodium chloride, potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, and sulfur, with our microminerals being zinc, selenium, manganese, iodine, fluorine, chromium, copper, iron, silicon, molybdenum, and cobalt. Water is the most abundant nutrient, it's the most needed nutrient, it's the largest constituent of an animal. At birth, body weight is 65 to 85% water. At maturity, it's 45 to 60%. Water deprivation of only a few percent is life-threatening. When we talk about dehydration in companion animals, you'll hear us talking about, well, they're 5% dehydrated. That's not very dehydrated. However, that means about, depending on their weight, could be anywhere from 500 to 2,000 milliliters of fluids. That's a fair amount of fluids. 12% dehydration, it's a very small amount, is life-threatening. They will die at 12%. Water-soluble vitamins for livestock would be B's and C's: biotin, thiamine, pyridoxine, cobalamin, niacin, folic acid, pantothenic acid, riboflavin, and vitamin C. We're going to talk about different feeding systems and different types of production animals and horses. So dairy cattle, when we're talking about 50% of the total cost of milk production. That means a lot of the cost of milk production, half the cost of milk production, is in just nutrition alone. The rest of it would be veterinary care, vaccines, etc. Is a way of weighing and blending all feedstuffs into a complete ration, and it's just putting everything together and putting it on the plate. Versus the other way we can pasture and a grain diet. So we can either give them a total mixed ration or put them on pasture and give them some supplements with feed, with grain. And usually we put them on pasture, bring them in twice a day for milking, and give them grain during that time. The productivity of lactating cows is determined by feeding. So if they don't eat, they don't produce. Lactation nutrition requirements are often several times the maintenance nutrition requirements. So as they're lactating, they need a lot more. Protein-wise, for lactating cows, those are usually supplied by forage or that concentrated food. Results of protein restriction mean we have less milk production and we can have increased reproductive problems. So they may not get pregnant, or they may not be able to have their offspring if they are pregnant. We cannot use any animal proteins in rations. We had mad cow disease several years back, and that was because some cows were fed some meat products, and that causes the prions live in these meat products. They're smaller than viruses, and it causes bovine spongiform encephalopathy. So we never want to use anything with animal proteins in the ration. So that means no milk, no dairy, no meat, nothing. Factors affecting water intake. So the more dry matter they intake, the more water they're going to need, their reproductive status, their activity, the type of feeding regimen they are on, their environment, their weight, their age, and the rate of gain. Importance of water. We need water for digestion, absorption, use of nutrients, and for production requirements. We have to be very, very careful about how we're providing water for animals. We want to make sure there's water always available, make sure that we're making sure we have full containers at least twice a day. They're clean. We have water heaters in the winter to prevent freezing, and that everything is algae-free and clean. If we have an uncovered water trough, animals will often get those pretty dirty pretty quickly. This is an example of a total mixed ration. Within this handful, we see hay, we see grain, we see corn stalks. There's a lot of stuff in here that all provide some of the nutrients that they need. This is an example of forage and grain. So this is hay, but they could also be on live grass, and then some grain that's available. Vitamin supplements. It's not necessary for water-soluble vitamins, which are B and C. These are readily synthesized by the animal. It's also not necessary for vitamin K. This is also readily synthesized by the animal. So what do we need as vitamin supplements for ruminants? A, D, E. Vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E are needed as vitamin supplements for ruminants, and they could come in the grain, or they could come in a mineral block, or they can come in other forms. Colostrum, very, very important for newborn calves that they get within the first 72 hours of life. Now, dairy calves never nurse their mom. They are given colostrum for the first 24 to 72 hours. They need it for energy, and they need it for maternal immunity from disease. Once they've been given the colostrum, they wean them back. They gradually add in milk, and they're giving milk at 10 to 12% of the body weight. We do want to give them colostrum within 4 to 6 hours of birth. Colostrum is collected from the cow. It can be stored frozen and then diluted with water if we have diarrhea occur. So colostrum is collected immediately after the animal is born. That colostrum is saved for that calf and also for other calves as well. Beef cattle. Beef or cattle, their nutrition is 75% of the cost of production. Beef cattle don't cost as much as dairy cattle to maintain. Nutrition is the biggest factor. So there are cost factors in what we determine is going to be best to feed beef cattle. The profitability of these beef cattle, what the cost of meat is these days will determine what we feed them. Also, how much weight can we have them gain? How are they breeding? Beef cattle are a cow-calf, what we consider cow-calf production. Profitability goal is to have a live calf produced by each cow each year. So cows are pregnant once a year. Their gestation period is 9 months, and then they are dried out for a couple months. Cows gaining weight just before and during breeding have higher conception rates. So we want to make sure that they're gaining weight during breeding time. Main sources are carbohydrates and then proteins and fat. Having high quality forage or pasture in the summer supplies all their energy. We may need to supplement with silage, which is fermented, already partially fermented carbohydrates, or hay. If we need to supplement the pasture. In winter, we want to feed pregnant cows winter rations, so increase their grain rations and then add vitamin and mineral supplements. Protein needs are adequate levels in the pastures, silages, and forages. Low-grade refuges can be supplemented. Corn, straw, stalks, we can use those. And what's really cool about ruminants is that they can eat really low-quality refuges, things that you wouldn't think that they would be able to eat. If you've ever seen cows wandering through a corn field that has been mowed down, they'll eat that corn stalk, the leftover corn stalk, and the microbes, the bacteria that live in their rumen, will actually turn it into high quality protein. Minerals and vitamins, mineral supplementation will be necessary, and it's usually offered on a free choice basis. We'll get a little mineral block here when they're on pasture. You also want to make sure you have a good pasture. A lot of times, roughage and pasture have adequate amounts of A and E. We want to make sure that they do. And then we would just need to supplement D, vitamin D, which of course we can get through sunlight as well. How do you know you have good pasture? Well, what you can do is you can take a sample of your pasture and a sample of the soil into your extension agent, which is somebody who works for the state, and there's one for each county, and they can test it for you. Calves, basically, they need to eat mother's milk, and beef cattle, we want them to nurse within 2 hours of birth for the colostrum. Remember, dairy calves, we want to give it to them within 4 to 6 hours. Beef cattle, because they're out on pasture typically when they're born, they need a much better immune system typically, and we want to get it into them a little quicker. We also can supplement them with what is called a creep feeder. This allows the calves to get into this area and eat extra rations cows do not need. So they can creep feed. Then we can wean them at 7 to 8 months, allow mom to dry off a little bit, and then rebreed her. We need to watch the calf. She needs to continue to thrive. We want to make sure there's no sign of mastitis in the cow and no decrease. What we call finishing cattle is to get them to their proper weight in order to butcher them. High energy diets, we want to give them high energy diets for weight gain. Feed at about 2 to 3% of body weight. The feed is going to contain high levels of grain, but there are side effects to that, so we can't do it for long periods of time. We may need to supplement protein as needed and add vitamin and mineral supplements as well. Generally, cattle are finished at 1 to 2 years, depends on the breed. Sheep, feeding is the single largest cost of maintaining sheep. Ewes are the foundation of the herd. They produce lambs, they generate wool. Generally, you will have a herd. Their energy requirements are completely dependent on the reproductive cycle. Obviously, lactating, they're going to need more, gestating a little bit more, lactating more than gestating though. There are variables in protein requirements based on breed size, body condition, age, reproductive status, ratio of protein to energy, and then something we call the non-protein nitrogen availability. Non-protein nitrogen is something that is actually labeled in the food, and because that helps the animal to process proteins a little bit better. So our feeding guidelines for NPN is we need to balance that NPN within the nutritional profile. We want to avoid sporadic availability. We want to have it available most of the time, but we want a nitrogen-sulfur ratio not more than 10 to 1. We want to restrict use to not more than 1% dry matter, with 1/3 of the total nitrogen ration being NPN. Prevent excess intake and possible toxicity. Watch NPN levels when coinciding with high roughage. So we have to be very careful. That's one thing with sheep we have to be super careful with, is the non-protein nitrogen. Pasture feeding is probably one of the best things that you can do with sheep. It provides exercise, decreased feed costs. A lot of land that would be unsuitable for other purposes we can use for sheep. Decreases disease transmission through close contact with other animals. Good quality pastures can provide good quality feedstuffs, and it's great for the first 2/3 of pregnancy. We're just going to need to supplement in the last trimester. Disadvantages, pasture really depends on soil quality. So how do we test it? Take it to our extension agent. Large acreage is often needed to support the animal's energy requirements. So if you have a small lot, you're going to need to supplement your animal. Land, if it's valuable for other uses, we may want to use that for other uses versus sheep. We need to remember that pasture is not suitable in the last trimester, so we want to supplement with grain at that point. And we need to offer minerals. So we can offer minerals with salt blocks. One very, very important point with sheep. Sheep blocks are different than goat, horse, or cow blocks, mineral blocks. Sheep blocks cannot have copper levels in it. If they have too much copper, their liver can't handle it and they will get sick. Lambs need colostrum within the first hour after birth. They can be weaned successfully at 8 weeks or even earlier. They can even be weaned at 1 day of age with a milk replacer, and then you can bottle feed them and wean them from that replacer at about 3 to 4 weeks. Lambs are susceptible to overeating. There is a vaccination at 2 months that can eliminate symptoms of overeating. Symptoms of overeating include ulcerations around the lips and the mouth. The swine industry, feed constitutes 60 to 70% of the total cost. Most swine are raised in confinement, and they're more prolific breeders than any other livestock. Their gestation period is shorter. It's 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days, whereas goats and sheep are 5 months, cows are 9 months, horses are 11 to 12 months. So they produce litters, not just 1 or 2 or 3 offspring, but they produce litters. So the 2 most common feeding methods would be high grain rations in self-feeders or limit feeding in breeding herds. Pig production, we have a breeding herd. You can have starter pigs and then growing finishing pigs, and these are separated into different groups. So you're going to have your breeding sows that are bred and typically artificially inseminated. And then they have their piglets, which are weaned and become starter pigs, and they're fed at a different ration than your growing and finishing pigs. Nutrient requirements are going to be different based on what group they're in, and they're based on the sow's reproductive cycle. Feeding during gestation, we have to be very careful to limit feed them because they can be overfeeding can actually impair lactation. Once they're lactating, we want to feed only twice a day and add additional feed for each piglet they have nursing. Vitamins need to be supplemented in the diet. And they do have mineral requirements that are supplemented throughout life. Calcium and phosphorus are important because low levels can cause fractures and lameness in females. Females are very large and they're standing on these little tiny legs, so we make sure they have adequate calcium, phosphorus. The other thing is that because these pigs are raised typically on concrete, they're not rooting, they're not getting iron from the soil. So a sow's milk is devoid of iron, so we need to make sure that we are giving iron as a supplement, and then we have to inject the piglets with iron as well to prevent iron deficiency anemia. Starter pigs are weaned at 3 to 5 weeks, and they're considered starters until they're about 40 to 50 pounds. Their diets are complex and complete, and you're going to find them as specific pig starter food. Then we move to pig finisher food at about 5 weeks. We'll call these growing finishing pigs. These diets are modified to complement genetic changes. We are breeding leaner pigs that need more protein but consume less energy. Corn, wheat, and sorghum and barley give us 60 to 85%. concentration is on amino acid levels more than protein content. So the breakdown of these proteins are amino acids. Protein sources are expensive, whereas we can synthesize amino acids and replace a portion of the protein source with no loss in performance. We can get these from soybean meal, meat and bone meal, and synthetic amino acids, and then provide mineral and vitamin supplements. The limiting ingredient for pigs is lysine. Lysine is the amino acid that is measured, and everything else is based on that. So lysine is really important for pigs. Depends on the efficiency and years of service. Well, nutrition helps with efficiency and years of service. Feed is definitely a cost factor. Foundation of horse food is based on hay and grass because those are the cheapest sources. Maintenance of life stage, if they're not pregnant, lactating, growing, or working, we just really need hay. We want to make sure we have a grass or legume hay. Legume means it contains beans or a bean type flour or fruit, I guess. Free choice water, and then adding minerals, calcium, phosphorus, and salt. If they have increased activity levels, we can add some grains to that, but most horses can subsist primarily on grass or hay. Just their energy need is similar to maintenance levels for the first 7 months or 2/3 of their pregnancy, so feed them the same. We want an ideal body condition score of a little bit bigger, 5 to 6 out of 9 when breeding. With lactation, they need twice the energy as for breeding. We don't want any protein restriction. They need minerals and vitamins in their ration. Once they are at 8 to 9 months of pregnancy, in their last trimester of pregnancy, we do need to increase their intake. Foals, we want to supplement foals, creep feed them starting at 2 months after they're born. They're going to start nibbling on grain and hay and basically everything else by 3. Feed above energy requirements because they'll be at risk for orthopedic disease. We want to just give them what they need to maintain their weight and to continue to grow. Hay and pasture, if we do a nutritional analysis, oftentimes that will provide what they need. For working horses, it really depends on how they're being exercised. There can be exercise light, moderate, heavy, or very heavy exercise. Monitor their water intake, and we may need to add additional protein based on what they're working, how they're working. Their daily energy requirements include energy needed for maintenance plus their energy expended during exercise. It's estimated from their heart rate and based on the National Research Council's calculations for energy consumption. We also need to monitor them for electrolytes. So if they're sweating a lot, we need to make sure that we're giving them back those electrolytes. Sick horses have protein calorie deficits. They may have hypermetabolic stress or catabolic wasting states where they're actually their body is eating away at their organs or their muscle tissue. If they have reduced gastrointestinal motility, that can be a concern as well. So a lot of information there. I'd highly recommend you read the chapter in your book on this chapter and put it with what you know with small animal as well, and look at those differences that you see between the two.